Brando and Joe is now on social media. You can follow us on Twitter at Brando and Joe.
You can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Brando and Joe Podcast. Please follow and subscribe.
Lastly, we have a Q&A out, so please make sure to submit your questions and we'll answer them throughout our episodes. Hi, and welcome to the Brando and Joe podcast. For this podcast episode, our guest is Dr. Anthony Auriemmo. He is currently working for Capri Holdings and has been an adjunct professor for many universities. Welcome, Anthony. How's it going today?
Welcome.
Thanks. It's going well today. Nice and not too early, not too late. I wish it wasn't raining.
It's been pretty crappy weather by us too, especially we were able to go to the Metro event yesterday.
Do you know, I think I saw you at Penn Station, actually, Joe. I kind of waved at you, but I was sort of going in the other direction. But I thought I saw you. I really wanted to go to that Metro event, too.
Do you remember what time it was around? Because we were at Penn.
For a while. We were there for a little bit.
Yeah.
Lost.
I was getting on a 5:14 train.
Oh, we were definitely there.
Yeah.
What time did we got there at... we were there. We got there early, like 4:30. And then we're like, I don't know, what should we do?
Yeah, you looked like you were waiting for someone, but I got there. I had maybe 4 or 5 minutes to catch my train, and I waved and kept walking. But I didn't think I recognized you. And then as soon as I was thinking, it was probably for the Metro event. And if not for the fact that I had things to do Tuesday night, Wednesday night, and now tonight, I would have probably gone, especially to see Seymour Adler, who I took classes with during my PhD, and he is an absolute superstar. So I'm glad to hear you went to see him.
Yeah, he was on.
Yeah.
It was the storytelling one. It was cool. They had us do like an activity.
Oh, really?
They gave us like data, right? And then like we answered questions.
Was it mostly students? Last time I went to Metro, it was very student heavy.
It was Baruch, us, and what was the other?
It was a school from New Haven.
Yes, yeah. It was packed, though.
No, anyway, I've noticed, like, since sort of, I hate to say post-pandemic, because I don't think it's ever really over, but since they started doing it in person again, I've noticed a lot of the older practitioners don't go as much as they used to, and I see a lot more students, which isn't a bad thing. It's just an observation.
Yeah, it creates a different environment for sure.
Yeah. The first one we went to back in, I think it was January, it was like half the amount of people. And then we showed up this time, and every single table was packed. Like there were some people standing.
Yeah, it was packed. We had 4 hostel tables.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, and once I saw it with Seymour, I knew it would be packed.
So you took Dr. Adler was your professor for some of your PhD classes?
So fun fact, he taught a class on performance assessment during my doctoral program, and he was doing it as an adjunct while he was still working at Aon. And I say still working at Aon. I don't think he ever really left anywhere. There was just a lot of acquisitions with his organization. And I'll never forget the class for a couple of reasons, but one of the reasons was I think Komala was negotiating with him to kind of stick around and keep adjuncting, even though I think he was trying to cut down on the amount of things he was doing. And so they agreed to have those classes meet at his office in a conference room after hours, like down on Water Street in the city. So the entire PhD cohort would like get on the Long Island Railroad, commute down to Aon by the South Street Seaport, and take a class in his conference room. And, we would get there and like get building passes and go all the way up to whatever floor he was on and, sit in a waiting room and all of that. So it was kind of funny. And then that class particularly was very, very practitioner focused, which was good. I don't know how much you know about the PhD program, but you sort of take 3 classes a semester. One is strictly research, one is strictly statistics, and then you get really one topical class per semester. And I find performance assessment and driving organizational performance to be more interesting than a lot of other topics. And so that particular semester was great because my topical class was an area that I was interested in. sometimes the topic of class was an area that it was just less where I was trying to be.
Is that not any like other PhD students from other schools probably traveled that much for classes, right? Was that very?
I wouldn't think so. I thought it was great. I mean, it was cool. I remember it being, it was still really early in my career, and I was working full time while in the PhD program. And I remember feeling like it did get a little harder every year. So when I first started, it was sort of, well, you could take mostly 6:30 and 8:30 p.m. classes after work. And then the following year or semester, it was like, well, we couldn't fit this class at any other time but 4:30. So hopefully you can make a 4:30 class work. And then I had a class with a different teacher who was saying that 4:30 was a little too late. Like even though the syllabus said 4:30 and the website said 4:30, we're going to do it at 3:30. And then it was like we're going to commute into the city for a class all the way down on Water Street. So it kept getting a little bit more tricky, but also I think that was good practice for real life and just kind of balancing commitments and flexibility. When I had my interview almost 6 years ago at what was then Michael Kors before we did our acquisitions and we became Capri, I remember I showed up at like 1:00 for, say, a 1-hour interview with one person. And I got about 30 minutes into it. And then she got pulled into a meeting with the CEO. And then they moved me to another room. And then they were like, wait, we have some time with this other person. Let's put you in front of this person. Are you okay to stay longer? Do you mind waiting a little while? We're going to try to get this person here. We're going to see if they're available. And I think I didn't leave till 5 or 6 or something like that. And more than a year later, I remember my boss at the time saying something to the effect of, we knew you were going to be a good fit here when we saw how flexible you were with the craziness of your interview process. And so, yeah, I think that, it's flexibility. I think it's just like people talk about it all the time. Like it's something that's important, but I do think in real life, it does help. I would say when I'm thinking earlier in my career. So, I guess as a student, like a master's or an undergraduate student, kind of being able to decide when I would. So, you go to high school and you go home and every day you have homework, you do your homework, you come in the next day and your homework's due. I do remember my first year or two of college feeling like this is a really interesting situation because usually things are due weeks later, or tests are once a quarter or something like that. And I liked the flexibility of deciding what to do when. And I don't think anyone would know it, but I think I am a bit of a procrastinator. And what served me really well in my time in college was I would pick the things that I really enjoyed, like the classes I was most interested in, or the projects or homeworks or tests or whatever it was that I wanted to do the most. And I would often prioritize that before the thing due soonest, because the thing due soonest was something I didn't want to do. And so it actually resulted in me being really productive because I was getting things done that looked like that should probably not have gotten done yet. And then, it was like the night before and I was like, all right, I finally have to do this homework for this sociology class or whatever it was. So that had kind of suited me well, even through my PhD, I was doing similar things to that. And during my undergraduate, I always felt like I was someone who needed to be so busy that I couldn't afford to procrastinate. Like if I had too much time on my hands, it just wasn't good for me. So basically from my second semester of college all the way through at least senior year, I was like overloaded credits, working in at least one research lab, doing an honors thesis. I was always finding like ways to keep myself busy, playing every intramural sport. Like I had a very, very full calendar. And maybe that was also how I was able to kind of manage the chaos of, we're calling it flexibility, but also sometimes it's chaos.
But so intramural sports aside, for your master's degree was in psychology, not industrial organizational psychology, right?
Yeah, so this is a kind of an interesting story. So when I did my undergraduate at Stony Brook, there was no IO psychology there. There might be at least a faculty member doing it now. I'm not 100% sure, but there was no IO psychology. You couldn't even take one intro level course. And the only thing I ever heard about IO psychology during my undergraduate was one faculty member who I loved and respected and who's a superstar in his field. He basically called it the dark side. He's like, you could do this because you care about research. You could do this because you care about therapy, or you could do this because you want to make money. It was sort of his thing. And the lack of pureness of research and organizational psychology. So that was pretty much all I heard of it, referred to as the dark side. And then when I was kind of in my senior year, I had done a undergraduate honors thesis, but I had done so many overloads and brought so many credits in from high school that I actually finished my honors thesis in my junior year. So in my senior year, I had a lot of time to take extra credits that psychology classes that I wouldn't have normally had to take, and work in different labs. And, I was kind of deciding, I was thinking of doing a PhD. I was kind of deciding where I wanted to go. Do I want to take a year off, this and that? And I was working in this really interesting lab with this faculty member who was originally based in Munich. And he was sort of debating between staying at Stony Brook or his old institution, Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, was trying to draw him back. And he was saying, well, stay with me either way. And so ultimately he stayed one more year and said, why don't you stick here and do this master's program that we're starting up this year so that we can continue to work together, and then we'll kind of take it from there. So I did the master's, and then after my master's was finished, he decided, you know what, my family wants to go back to Munich. I'm going to move back to Munich. I'm going to take this role at this other institution. And he offered me a job there teaching and doing research. So I was teaching classes. So I moved to Munich at 22 years old in the beginning of September. This was back in 2010. So I moved to Munich. I got an apartment. I went to the Oktoberfest. Oktoberfest is a celebration of a wedding that happened a million years ago on the first weekend in October. So most of the festivities are in the 2 weeks in September leading up to that first weekend of October. So showing up in September is perfect timing. So anyway, I spent a year teaching and doing research there, and I was doing research on the color red and eye tracking activity and startle response, and a field called psychophysiology. And I liked it a lot because I think it spoke to my interest in doing what I would call more pure research. And I know at the time it used to, there was, I don't think people talk about it this way anymore, but they used to talk about hard science and soft science. Now they say things like social science and whatever. I don't even know what they call the other side of it. But we were talking about hard science and soft science. And I always felt like that's not really a fair evaluation. Just because something's more difficult to measure doesn't mean it's not as good, right? Just because we can't just solve it with a math problem with a definitive answer doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to seek answers. And I was a little bit trying to balance in my own head why I felt like, should have I done, more pure research and been more on the hard science side. And I also felt like I wanted to do something that was a little bit more respected by my friends who were outside of the psychology community, being, thinking of psychology as sort of a softer science. So I found this little niche in, psychophysiology, which was more concrete physiological measures of psychological phenomenon, right? So I thought that was kind of an interesting way for me to. I have one or two papers that I had been on in that area, and I thought it was interesting, but ultimately, after doing it at Stony Brook for a few years and then doing it in Munich, where I kind of landed was I really like having a question that I want to find an answer to, and I really like doing the research to figure out what that answer is. But what I really didn't love is all the reading and writing that kind of bookended that process. If somebody could just do the literature search, tell me what their question is, let me design the research program, run the study, analyze the results, and then hand it back off to them, that would be sort of my perfect world. I didn't like the idea of, and I also wanted it to have a purpose in life. I kind of wanted the solution to matter to someone, which maybe sounds ridiculous, but I didn't think I wanted it to just be something like we did this so that we could write a paper, so that we could publish it in a journal and hope someone reads it.
Gets lost in like the literature world.
Yeah. So I was struggling a little bit about whether I really wanted to do this, and I was watching. House was really popular at that time, and I was watching episodes of that show, and I was thinking to myself, "Oh, this is so cool. Maybe I got it wrong. Maybe I should have done medicine." And then I thought more about it, and what I realized is it was the problem solving aspect that was really interesting to me. I liked that, he was given a puzzle that, most people couldn't figure out, but that, if you worked hard at it and you took a scientific approach, you could find an answer. And so I decided after a year in Munich that I was going to come back home, and I had this master's degree from Stony Brook, which was in general psychology. Although before I walk away from this general psychology master's conversation, I want to make a caveat that it was the first year Stony Brook did that program. And there were no master's classes and doctoral classes. So the classes you took as part of your master's degree at Stony Brook were R1 doctoral research classes where the term paper was writing a grant proposal. So I think that to some extent, the master's at Stony Brook was a little bit less useful than I wanted it to be from a topical perspective, because it was very broad psychology. I took a class in clinical, I took a class in teaching, I took a class in all sorts of different areas. But from when I got to the PhD program at Hofstra and we started doing research classes, it was like a joke to me because I had done it at such a ridiculous level for so many years at Stony Brook that like my research skills were far superior than many in my cohort. So that was like the one plug I'll give Stony Brook is, I think in a lot of schools, a master's and a PhD class are treated very differently. Whereas at Stony Brook, it was very commingled, and it was, you got to see what it would be like to be a doctoral student and how difficult it could be. So then I was basically coming home. I had my master's. I was in Munich. I was trying to figure out what to do next. I decided I wanted to do this problem solving thing. And I knew I was going to need to get a job because I was leaving the job that I had in Munich. And I was sort of really generally Googling what to do with a master's degree in psychology. And I saw this thing called IO psychology. And I remembered it. Oh, yeah, that was the dark side. I remember this being the dark side. And so I called Komala Shahani and inquired about respecializing my master's degree. I don't know if that's actually a thing. I use those words. I don't know if those words actually mean anything to anyone other than me. But I had this idea that I already had a master's, so maybe I could take a few classes in IO, and you could say like, well, you have a master's and you know some IO stuff. Now you have a master's in IO. And I guess in our conversation about, sort of what I had done so far in the labs I had worked in and my time in Munich and whatnot, she said, well, there's no such thing as respecializing a master's. I don't know where you got that crazy nonsense, but you might want to consider applying for a doctoral program here. And it's not like that was such a foreign idea to me. I mean, I had considered doing a PhD in Munich, which I didn't. I thought about it, but I would have needed to stay there many more years. And it's kind of difficult to be that far from everyone for so long. So I applied to the program and I got in, and I was kind of at Hofstra doing school while working full time, because now once I got back, I was, 23, 24 years old. Like I kind of wanted to have a life outside of just school. And I do remember one other thing was the absolute shocking moment. So remember, you have to remember my background is from an R1 school where doctoral students are like completely funded. And I just remember being in Terry Shapiro's office and her like explaining the tuition to me. I'm like, I'm sorry, there's tuition. And that was the first time I almost dropped out. And and she explained it really well. She was like, we could work you to death in research labs, make you teach 1 million classes and give you a stipend. But this is an applied program, and we want you to come out of here with actual work experience. We want you to come out of here with an internship or some time working and whatnot. And we think that that's a better use of your time than, teaching undergraduates intro to psychology and working on somebody else's research. And, she did a whole math thing for me about like how much you would make at a job versus how much you're spending in tuition. I mean, net, you're actually making more money, taking a loan and earning versus, earning $20,000 a year in stipends or whatever it was at the time. So I agreed, and I started, and I had to do this, kind of 1 year of master's prereq classes. So then I was kind of on the other side of it. So when I was at Stony Brook, I was like the master's student in doctoral classes, and now I'm the doctoral student in master's classes. And that was an interesting experience to be on the other side. And yeah, I found a full-time role doing recruiting analytics and recruiting. And I did that for the kind of early stage, most of my time working on my doctoral program. And that company got acquired. I left. I had like 6 weeks before I started my next job, and then I defended my dissertation in December 2016.
Wow.
Yeah.
Was when you finally defended your dissertation, I know you said you went into a little bit of recruiting, but did you have an idea of kind of what you wanted to do in IO, or is it right after you got your PhD, you were like, I'll kind of just take anything and then I'll see where it leads me? Or were you like, oh, I want to go into recruiting or compensation? Or
finishing a PhD is a little bit different than finishing an undergraduate or master's. Like there's no magic, especially since you're working. I worked through the whole thing from day one. So it's not like now I'm finished, something magic happened and I want to go do something. It was more like I was shaping my career throughout the program. So that I would just like say that's the first piece. Another thing to just be aware of with a PhD is, you know the date of your graduation, the day you show up for undergrad, the day you show up for your master's program. You know when your graduation is going to be as long as you pass your classes and don't mess around and whatnot. A PhD, you never really know. So it wasn't like, okay, when I graduate, I'm going to do this. It was more like, if I graduate, we'll see what happens. No, but pretty much throughout my entire PhD, I was thinking I was going to do people analytics. I was really interested in some of the work they were doing at JetBlue with their engagement survey programs and what the kind of like, well, it's been so long now that back then Southwest was like the best airline. And they were talking about how like they drove performance doing job rotations, and there were like these great case studies about what they were doing. And I remember thinking, I want to do people analytics or consulting. That's what I was really interested in. And so when I got my first job that was, what I would call loosely tied to the IO space, so when I came back from Munich, I needed a job to pay bills because the Hofstra PhD program wasn't going to start for a whole year. And because I came back over the summer and it was too late to apply for the fall. So I basically got in for the following year. And I needed a job. I ended up working at a furniture store selling furniture on commission. I did it for a few months. They ended up promoting me to store manager, which I did for about another year. And so, which overlapped a little bit with me starting the prereq program at Hofstra. So while I was doing that, I was trying to figure my way out of working as a retail store manager because that obviously wasn't what I wanted to do with a PhD. And I found this kind of interesting in that there was this company, Sleepy's, that no longer exists, that were looking for a sales recruiter. And I was thinking to myself, I'm the hiring manager who decides whether or not to hire people to sell mattresses at my furniture store. Why wouldn't I be a good fit here? And so I interviewed for that job in December of 2012. And they were looking for someone with more recruiting experience. They passed, but I remember that recruiter being really, really interested in my profile from an IO psychology perspective. He thought like my analytics skills and things like that would really be helpful there. And I stayed in touch with him. And then a few months later, in March 2013, there was an opening on his team. And what they wanted me to do is part-time recruiting and part-time, so full-time job, but part-time recruiting, part-time analytics for the recruiting team, time to fill, things like this, turnover and all of that. And over the time that I was in that role, what was happening is my boss and his boss kept getting promoted. And I eventually kind of moved out of recruiting and into HR because the head of recruiting who hired me turned into the head of HR. And now he was no longer just interested in recruiting analytics. He wanted to see more broad people analytics. And I ended up going into his office and saying, like, I don't want to do two jobs poorly anymore. Like I need to really spend 40 hours a week on people analytics if we're going to build this function and do anything useful here. So I stopped recruiting and moved into people analytics. That lasted for, 6 months maybe. And then they wanted to look at a couple different things. There was a commission program that they were using. They felt that needed an evaluation and a revamp. And there was no sort of job architecture. I don't know if you're familiar with that idea, but manager, senior manager, director, comp grades, structure in terms of career pathing, appropriateness of how to pay people. None of that existed. So it was a very frugal company, and they said, well, we're going to hire these consultants. At the time, it was just Towers Watson. Now they're called WTW. We're going to hire these consultants, but to save money, they're only going to give us advice. Anthony, you're going to do all the data work. Whether you know how to or not, like they'll tell you what you have to do, you'll figure it out because you're the numbers guy. So I did get this really cool experience of, two like full scale consulting jobs with Willis Towers Watson to build a comp program for, retail employees, and then also built a whole career infrastructure for corporate employees. And it kind of gave me this opportunity to really spend a lot of time with leaders and walking through what would work and what would not work. I was in and out of our COO's office all the time. I was meeting with each executive. We also did our first employee survey there, and I was going from leader to leader, kind of debriefing them on their results. So I got a lot of experience with data there. And I think in my last year and a half, now that the people analytics stuff was in a really good place, we were doing quarterly dashboards, we were doing, semi-annual surveys, we had a compensation structure, we knew what level every job was. I mean, we were in a much, much better place. And then they said, okay, now that we're in a good place, we need an HR system. We can't keep using, we had like a hardware-based system. Like it was like installed on your computer like it was the 1900s. So we're going to do an RFP, and they included me on the team to try to evaluate what system we wanted. And we ultimately chose Workday. And then I was one of the project managers on the Workday implementation. I also held the role of training and change management for the whole Workday project, and then the compensation and analytics subject matter expert. So I had to basically put down most of my full-time responsibilities and be like full-time working on Workday stuff, from implementation to the training, to the change management, to making sure all the processes met like my expectations from that the data we were capturing was what I was going to need for analytics. It was a huge project. It took at least a year. And I actually ended up working with someone at Sleepy's who was working more on the HRIT side or HRIS side, who now works for me at Capri, which is great. It's like really nice to be back together. Yeah. So I sort of went from I'm doing analytics to, well, you're good at math, so do compensation, to you understand technical stuff, so do software. And after the acquisition happened, I think that was in like 2016, and they closed the whole New York office. I moved on. I finished my dissertation and moved on to this software startup company. And again, I took a role just in analytics. Like I just was like, I'm going back to analytics. I'm an IO person. That's what I want to do. I wasn't there 3 months before they gave me compensation. And it was the same story. It was like, we don't have any career infrastructure. There's no job architecture. We don't know what we should be paying people. Can you build it all out for us? I did. Startups are fun and they're really romanticized. And there was aspects I really liked. We had a beer fridge and we had like cold brew coffee on tap and, all the snacks and free lunch on Fridays and everything. but the amount of leadership change, I'm like a person who likes change. I get bored very easily. I like things to be chaotic. But when you can't even have the same, when you have a different boss every day and they have completely different mindsets, it's not always great. So I was seeing some turnover. I think they were deciding between selling or going or doing an IPO, and they were bringing in new leaders. And they moved me under someone who I think really just didn't value education, and that wasn't working for me. Like I got not great vibes, and I thought they were going to just sell, and I was going to end up looking for a job again anyway. So I applied to 2 jobs, one to do consulting at Aon and one to work at Michael Kors. And the Michael Kors job was in compensation specifically. And I said to myself, I'm like, well, everyone wants me to do comp. Maybe I should just do it. But I had remember thinking back to when I was first getting into IO psychology, I always pictured myself doing analytics or consulting. So in my mind, I had gone for the interviews at Aon. I was like, by the time I was going to have my interview at Michael Kors, I almost politely canceled because I was so convinced I was going to go to Aon. And then I interviewed with my prior boss, who was, I always say, like, I left that interview thinking there's no world in where I don't work for this person. She was so smart. She had a consult. She was a former actuary. She had a consulting background. She worked at big companies like Siemens. Like, she really knew, and she was just like, she was someone who I just felt like I really could actually learn a lot from. Her name's Yvonne Delaney. She left Capri almost 2 years ago. She's the CHRO of Yeti now, the cooler company.
Wow.
So,
Awesome.
yeah, superstar. I still talk to her all the time. So once I met her, I knew I had to take this job at Michael Kors. I joined Michael Kors with the idea of doing just compensation, and a little more than a year in, they promoted me and gave me analytics, and I was like, I'm meant to have both forever. And then sort of as time continued there, Workday kind of came into the fold again. We were already using Workday, but the Workday team was, the Workday team needed help and needed a little bit of restructuring. And so they, moved some of that function under me. And I, called my friend Lauren from my prior job and said, let's fix this together. And then eventually my old boss left, and now I report to the chief people officer, who's also spectacular. I mean, she's great too. She was one of the people who interviewed me on that crazy day back in 2017 when I was getting bounced from office to office. She's awesome too. And at that point, they basically had promoted me into my boss's old role, which is to oversee compensation, benefits, HR, people analytics, and the Workday infrastructure as well. So that was the journey, so to speak.
It's interesting how you kind of morphed into compensation with that, because I've always seen compensation more as like a MBA business degree, and it still followed with your analytics and your psychology background as well. That's like a really interesting path to compensation.
Yeah, well, and to bring it a little bit full circle, when I would be sitting in Seymour Adler's classes and still working at Sleepy's doing analytics, I was, Seymour did a really good job explaining how, if you're going to build a high performance culture, you need to make sure that you're rewarding high performers at a much higher clip than average performers. It's not about giving average performers like average and low performers little. It's really about like the multiple of how much more you give to the high performers. And I remember doing the pay for performance analytics and sort of the turnover metrics and looking at the comp data at Sleepy's before I had compensation and saying, it's really difficult to be a talent management person who's trying to preach pay for performance and building a strong performance culture and setting up a performance management structure and a talent lifecycle and all of this stuff, and having no impact or say on how pay review or merit budgets get addressed. And so I remember being in Seymour's class thinking, like, I'm in a really cool, unique place where I could do a little bit of both, where I could build the performance management program, but tie in pay as I go. And I did a talk about this at Disrupt HR many years ago, and that like it's really important to have these things together and understand it holistically. And it's not really, it's not enough to just say, okay, the budget's 3%, you're a high performer, I'll give you 4. Seymour used to talk about the idea of least noticeable difference from perceptual psychology. You remember there were like these really old studies where they would they'd light a candle and they'd keep walking further and further and further away and see at what point can you no longer see the candle. Or like they'd put like 100 pieces of paper in each of your hands and add like one page to one hand, at a time until you could feel one weighed more.
Yeah.
And
that's cool.
Very old school from the cognitive psychology 200 level class at Stony Brook a million years ago. But Seymour used to talk about like that being like the bare minimum in terms of pay for performance for a high performer, right? How are you if you could barely tell, like what is a 1% difference for a high performer or a star performer over the course of a year at even at $100,000, 1%'s $1,000 divided by 12. You're talking about, it's nothing, right? So you have to be really careful in that if you're able to identify who these star performers are, you have to make sure that you're doing the things you need to do to retain them. And then the other thing that they're at the time, I want to say it was like the 2015, 2016 timeframe, or maybe it was 2014, 2015. There was this weird zeitgeist about getting rid of performance reviews and, no one likes them. Everyone hates doing them. We shouldn't do performance reviews anymore. And Seymour spoke very passionately about how, because something is hard to measure, we shouldn't stop measuring it. How are you going to reward high performers if you don't measure performance? And then I was kind of thinking about it even further, just from an IO perspective. We use performance data to build assessments for selection. We use performance data to evaluate who should get promoted. We use performance data to figure out what areas in the organization are performing well and where we might need change and how we build our structures. There's just so much it's useful for. And the thought of just like throwing it all out really upset me. And so that's what I ended up doing that talk on, because there was this like movement towards getting rid of performance reviews. And I think it was at that point that I was pretty adamant that I was never going to give away that part of compensation, because sometimes performance review finds its way into like a talent management team. And I really don't like it separated. I think it's good when it's all coming from one source.
It's cool to hear about this because I feel like we don't really get to learn as much about like this compensation side. I feel like we could have a whole podcast episode just listening about like your breakdown of what you do at companies.
Well, and I have a motivation textbook here, and from when I was in my math, like my prereq times, and when I started doing compensation work, especially incentive compensation work, where you're designing a commission program or a bonus program, and the goal of it is to motivate people to do what you want them to do. I mean, if you read through there's no other area, including performance management, that I've touched in HR, right? I've worked in recruiting, I've worked in systems, I've done performance management, but the most times I've cited an actual IO psychology principle theory research has been in compensation, because I was explaining how, well, if you think about, the VIE theory or expectancy theory or whatnot, I could tell you that this compensation program is not going to work and explain why, right? Or the theory of planned behavior or something like that. I would like use that in meetings to explain to someone why we have to design a compensation program differently. And when I think I still do this to some extent. When we hire a new analyst on the comp team, I make them read The Folly of Rewarding A While Hoping for B, which is a great article by Stephen Kerr from like 1995 or something like that. If you haven't read it, you should read it. And it's an article about how we typically tend to design pay programs to reward the most measurable statistic. And even though we actually want something different. And so, Kerr talks about the medical industry, nursing. He talks a little bit about the NBA, where there's this thought of like we want team players who go in there and get rebounds and assists and whatnot. But at the end of the day, we pay the guy who scores the most money. And there's a lot of good. There's he talks about car sales where we say we want a good customer experience, but then when we pay straight commission, they have no reason to give a good customer experience to anyone who's not making a purchase. So I did find that the compensation area actually lets me leverage IO psychology more than other areas. And I've submitted talks to PsyOp at least twice now, saying like to do a talk about why are we so afraid to get into compensation as a field. And both times they were rejected, saying compensation is not really IO psychology. Which is sad because the whole talk was about how it is and it should be thought of as. And they're like, it's not. Get out. Yeah.
You just explained to us how it was.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
Well, we appreciate all of this like knowledge and the way you kind of gotten into the field and really interesting path. We don't want to take up too much of your day. We know that you've got a lot. You like the chaos, and you probably have a lot going on. But we just really wanted to thank you for your time coming with us today and really giving us a really good look into IO and also compensation and how compensation does relate to IO. We really do appreciate it, Anthony.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we'll see you at a SAP when we could do like a quick 5-minute Q&A.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I'll be there in April.
That's so cool. Well, thank you again so much, Anthony. Thank you.
No problem. See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye. So it was really great talking with Anthony. Compensation is definitely something I haven't heard about, right when I entered the field of IO. But I'm glad he was able to speak on it and kind of get that job opportunity out and tell people about what it is. Because it's something that sounds really interesting, but it doesn't seem like something that people have heard about before.
Yeah, no, I agree. The interesting thing about what we listened to with Anthony was really his pathway to compensation. You kind of get started and you're looking in the field at what you want to do, and it can always end up being something completely different in the end result than what you were thinking. And, for prospective students out there, it's really interesting to look at that because, you don't have to pigeonhole yourself into anything. You can look at a career and it can kind of parlay into something else. You never know. So it's really great that this is kind of the field and how it works. IO is really like a multifaceted field. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, 100%. I also thought it was pretty cool. The company works for Capri Holdings.
Oh, yeah.
It sounds like it's a cool international company, in London and in Milan and New York City. I think it would be hard to find that uninteresting.
Definitely.
But it was great having Anthony on. We'll put his LinkedIn in the bio. You guys can check him out. Highly suggest just looking at his career path and the experiences he had. Just be super helpful for anyone getting into the field.
Definitely. Thank you, guys.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Catch you next week.